such as avocados, cashew nuts that we simply can't grow in the UK, and I know that UK consumers and African producers will benefit from growth in those areas in years to come.
Thank you. Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Helen Whately.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, later today, this House will have an opportunity to pay tribute to the Clerk of the House, Sir David Knatzler. May I take this opportunity to add my own? Sir David has served this House for over 40 years with dedication and tireless devotion. His support and advice on parliamentary procedure and business has been invaluable, and I know that members from all sides of the House will want to join me in thanking him for his service and in wishing him the very best for the future. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Helen Whately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I also pay tribute to the work of the Clerk of the House? In January, a mother of a 3-year-old girl was convicted of female genital mutilation. Our first FGM conviction, but a chilling reminder that young girls are still being cut, not just in Africa and around the world, but also here in the UK. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, make government time to progress my honourable friend, the member for Richmond Park's bill to protect more girls from this abhorrent practice?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the issue of this abhorrent practice, to recognise the importance of that first prosecution that took place on female genital mutilation here in the UK. It's only right that we find time for this bill, and the government will provide time to deliver it. We've strengthened the law on FGM. Leading to that first conviction, we're helping communities around the world to end this appalling crime. But it is important that we give time to this bill and act further to ensure that we end what is an absolutely abhorrent crime that scars young girls for the rest of their lives, both physically and mentally.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister and the whole House will join me in sending our deepest sympathies to the friends and family of the cadet who died at Sandhurst last week. I'm sure the MOD is supporting the family and fellow cadets at a difficult time, but I also hope they will be reviewing the mental health support they give to all members of the armed forces at all times. Mr. Speaker, we also mourn the loss of Gordon Banks and send our condolences to his friends and family and the entire football community. He was one of the greatest goalkeepers of all time, 73 caps for England, including playing in every single game during the victorious 1966 World Cup campaign, which I remember with joy. Mr. Speaker, I also want to thank Sir David Knatzler for his work as Clerk to the House and wish him well in his retirement. He's been here even longer than I have and has always been a source of advice to all members, irrespective of their party, and I always admire his dry wit and humour whilst describing the proceedings of the House. I think we owe him a big debt of gratitude. Mr. Speaker, the government's handling of Brexit has been costly, shambolic and deliberately evasive. Nothing symbolises that more than the fiasco of seaborne freight. A company with no ships and no trading history. On the 8th of January, the Transport Secretary told the House, "We're confident the firm will deliver the service." What went wrong?
First of all, can I join the right honourable gentleman in the remarks he made about the cadet at Sandhurst? He referenced the issue of mental health. This is an important issue overall, but obviously an important issue in our armed forces as well. And I'd like to pay tribute to the work of my honourable friend, the member for Plymouth Moor View, for the work that he has done in relation to mental health in the armed forces. I'd also like to send my deepest sympathies to the family and friends of Gordon Banks. Like the right honourable gentleman, I'm old enough to remember the 1966 World Cup. Now, let's be honest in this House. I think that's important. But from being part of that team to I think something else that people remember, the astonishing Pelé save in 1970. He was regarded as one of the world's greatest goalkeepers. But I also know that he did a lot of community work in his local area as well. And I know members from all sides of the House would like to join me in paying tribute to him. As regards the freight capacity, the government let 3 contracts. 90% of that was let to DFDS and Brittany Ferries. Those contracts remain in place, and that capacity has been obtained. And due diligence was carried out on all of these contracts. And as the Secretary of State for Transport made clear in this House earlier this week, we will continue to ensure that we provide that capacity, which is important in a no-deal situation, and we will ensure the capacity is there.
Mr. Speaker, the Transport Secretary told the House that this decision to award a contract to Seaborne Freight had no cost to the taxpayer. This week, the National Audit Office found that £800,000 had been spent on external consultants to assess the bid. Will the Prime Minister use this opportunity to correct the record?
I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, he's a bit late to the party on this, because I was asked this question yesterday in the statement, I think, from the SNP benches. So Labour following the SNP. Well, whatever next. Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that, of course, as I've just said, when these contracts were all let, proper due diligence was carried out. That included third-party assessment of the companies that were bidding for the contracts. There would have been a cost attached to this process, regardless of who the contracts were entered into with.
Jeremy Corbyn!
I'm really impressed that the Prime Minister can keep a straight face while she said due diligence was carried out. The Transport Secretary said its business and operational plans were assessed for the department by external advisers. On the basis of that advice to his own department, Seaborne was a start-up company with no ships, and the contract was high risk, is what he was told. Why then, if he was told it was high risk, did he proceed with the contract?
To the right honourable gentleman, what he appears to be suggesting is that the government should never look at start-up companies, should never look at the opportunities for new companies to be undertaking this here. But it is entirely right that the government has ensured that the majority of these contracts went to established companies, and I think it's entirely right that a company of which due diligence had been carried out. It's no good saying it wasn't, because it was, and we will ensure that the ferry capacity is there. What we're doing, of course, in these contracts is ensuring that we are able to deal with the situation were we to enter into no deal. Now, the right honourable gentleman has said in the past that he didn't actually want any money being spent on no deal preparations. He's also said in the past that he doesn't want us to go into a no deal situation. That's fine, but if he doesn't want us to be in a no-deal situation, he's going to have to vote for the deal.
Jeremy Corbyn!
It appears that we have to be fair to those advisers, because they were instructed to restrict their due diligence to the face value of the presentation put to them by Seaborne Freight, a company that had no trading history, and look into the directors of Seaborne, some of whom it appears would not have passed a due diligence test. However, the Transport Secretary told the House this procurement was done properly in a way that conforms with government rules. But what a Freedom of Information request reveals is that the Secretary of State bypassed those rules, as the Procurement Assurance Board, a senior panel of experts and lawyers, were denied the chance to scrutinise the deal. So what action is the Prime Minister going to take over what appears to be a very clear breach of those rules?
The contract was awarded following commercial, technical and financial assurance at a level in line with the company's status as a new entrant to the market. carried out not only by senior DfT officials, but by third-party organisations with experience and expertise in this area. That includes Deloitte's, Mott MacDonald and Slaughter and May. It was designed in recognition of the risks posed. No money was paid to the contractor. No money would be paid until services were delivered, and therefore no money has been paid to that contractor. But I say to the right honourable gentleman, he has stood here time and time again and said actually that we shouldn't be doing anything to prepare for no deal. It is entirely right and proper that this government is taking the action necessary to ensure that it's not our policy to have a no deal, it is our policy to get a deal. But should we be in that no deal situation, we need to ensure we have the capacity we need, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Could I bring the Prime Minister back to the question of seaborne ferries? Eurotunnel has called this ferry contract procurement secretive and flawed exercise. And taxpayers now face a legal bill of nearly £1 million contesting that. The money goes up and up. The Secretary of State's decision to award the contract to Seabourn has increased the budget deficit of Thanet Council, the owners of Ramsgate Port, by nearly £2 million. When questioned on this by the member for South Thanet, the Transport Secretary refused to give a guarantee. Can the Prime Minister today give a cast-iron commitment to the people of Thanet and confirm they won't be picking up the bill for this failure of this contract?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that the Department of Transport and other parts of government are in discussion with Thanet Council about the issue of this contract and the impact of this contract. But can I also just again remind the right honourable gentleman of why it is that the Department of Transport has taken these actions in relation to ferry capacity? It is in order to be able to ensure that in a no-deal situation we are able to guarantee that medicines will be brought into this country. Primarily, we're prioritising medicines being brought into this country. Again, that was a question I seem to remember being asked on more than one occasion yesterday by members of the SNP who had an interest in that. The right honourable gentleman doesn't seem to be interested in ensuring that we can, in a no-deal situation, provide the medicines that people in this country need. That's what we're doing. That's a sensible approach of a government that is taking this matter seriously.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Maybe the Prime Minister should follow the advice of the House and take no deal off the table and negotiate seriously with the European Union. And it cannot be right, Mr. Speaker, it cannot be right that a hard-pressed local council and local taxpayers are footing the bill for the incompetence of the Secretary of State for Transport and this government. The spectacular failure of this contract is a symptom, Mr. Speaker, of the utter shambles of this government and its no-deal preparations. The Transport Secretary ignored warnings about drones and airport security, gave a £1.4 billion contract to Carillion despite warnings over their finances. He oversaw the disastrous new rail timetables last year, rail punctuality at a 13-year low and fares at a record high. That is some achievement. And now the Transport Secretary is in charge of a major and vital aspect of Brexit planning. How on earth, Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister say that she has confidence in the Transport Secretary?
Let me tell the right honourable gentleman what the Transport Secretary is delivering. The biggest rail investment programme since the Victorian era. Spending nearly £48 billion on improving our railways to deliver better journeys. 20% higher on average every year than under a Labour government. That's what the Transport Secretary is delivering. Commitment to transport in this country and commitment to transport across the whole of this country. But I notice that the right honourable gentleman wanted to focus his questions in that way, rather than asking more general questions in relation to Brexit, because of course there are still a number of issues. There's still a number of issues on Brexit where we don't know his answers to the big questions. We don't know if he'd... It's no good, Labour members, almost burying their heads in their hands. We don't know whether their leader backs the second referendum. We don't know whether their leader backs the deal. We don't even know whether he backs Brexit. He prefers ambiguity and playing politics to acting in the national interest. People used to say he was a conviction politician. Not anymore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, I visited Tiverton High School, a great local school rated good by Ofsted. But Tiverton High School is facing many challenges. The buildings are old and stressed. There's not enough capacity for all local children to attend Tiverton High School because of a growing town and a great town. But also poverty is higher than both the county and England's national average. The school buildings are located in a flood zone. That means that when the X bursts its bank, there is a significant risk to life. That means we really do need a new school. Fortunately, we have a site. Planning Mission and Devon County Council has completed a plan. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, facilitate meetings between me, the school ministers, so that we can together deliver a new school that Tiverton deserves?
Can I thank my honourable friend for raising this issue with me? And obviously the quality of school buildings is an important issue in our education system. That's why we are putting more money into it, and we're investing £23 billion on school buildings through to 2021. But he's raised the specific issue of Tiverton High School, and I'm sure, and I will make sure that a minister from the Department of Education will be happy to meet him and with the head teacher and the council, if that is appropriate, to discuss this issue.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate so many of my colleagues who are sporting yellow today as a mark of solidarity with those from Catalonia that are on trial for the political principle of supporting self-determination. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister rule out bringing the meaningful vote to this House less than 2 weeks before the 29th of March?
The right honourable gentleman was present yesterday when I made my statement to the House, and he heard the process that we will be following. There, of course, is a debate that is taking place tomorrow, and then we have made clear that we would bring back, if a meaningful vote hasn't been brought back and passed by this House, we'll make a statement on the 26th of February and a debate on an amendable motion on the 27th.
Ian Blackford.
Well, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that was no answer from a Prime Minister that continues to run the clock down. This is the height of arrogance from a government set on running the clock down. Just 44 days from a no-deal scenario, the Prime Minister is hung-strung by her own party and rejected by European leaders. The Prime Minister must stop playing fast and loose. Businesses are begging for certainty. The economy is already suffering. Prime Minister, you've come to the end of the road, rumbled by your own loose-lipped senior Brexit advisor. Will the Prime Minister now face down the extremists in their own party and extend Article 50?
To the right honourable gentleman, he talks about certainty for business. He can give business certainty by voting for the deal. That's what gives business certainty. He complains about no deal, but of course it was the SNP who wanted to leave the UK without a plan, and perhaps we should remind the SNP that independence would have meant leaving the EU with no deal.
Nigel Evans.
Mr. Speaker, I'll be chairing a delegated legislation while the tributes to David Narsler are paid. So could I publicly wish him well on his retirement and thank him for all the support he gave to me, particularly when I was Deputy Speaker. Thank you, David. Good luck. Sladeburn Health Centre serves 1,100 people in the village and surrounding rural areas. It's well used and well loved by an ageing population with no bus service, and the contract's up for renewal, and people really do fear the salami slicing of services, or even worse, the closure. So will the Prime Minister publicly give her support to health services like Sladeburn today, and to say that either reduction of services or indeed even worse, closure would be totally unacceptable?
Can I say to my right honourable friend, first of all, I'm aware of the issues with Slaburn country practice. And, of course, we're aware of the pressures facing GPs. That's why there's going to be a major new investment in primary and community health care. This is a very important element of our National Health Service, and that has been set out in the long-term plan. In the event of a practice closure, of course, what NHS England does is assesses the need for a replacement provider before dispersing the list of patients who are at that GP surgery. I understand in relation to Slaburn Health Centre that discussions are ongoing in relation to the future of the practice, and the local CCG are currently exploring options.
I'm sure the Prime Minister welcomes the news that Instagram has pledged to crack down on images of suicide and self-harm. However, there are growing online communities which glamorise, encourage and normalise eating disorders, preying on vulnerable people who are going through extremely personal and private battles. Will she agree to meet with me, other organisations and charities to discuss ways in which we can combat this?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising the action that the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport is taking in relation to this issue of social media sites, and indeed the action that the Home Office is taking in conjunction with DCMS on this issue. We do want to see social media companies doing more to ensure that they're not promoting harmful content to vulnerable people. The honourable gentleman has raised the specific issue of, I think, eating disorders was in his question, and the impact that that can have. We do want to ensure that we're doing this in a way that does help to keep people safe in terms of what the sort of images that they're looking at. And I will ensure that a minister from the department meets with him to discuss this issue.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding Brussels barroom chatter, will the Prime Minister rule out a delay of Brexit beyond March the 29th? And will she also rule out a future customs union arrangement which would prevent us doing those global trade deals which the Bank of England Governor says is a potential golden age of trade?
As my honourable friend knows, I've been very clear, and the government's been clear in the proposals that we've put forward for customs, that we want to have that independent trade policy. It's specifically referenced in the political declaration, and we believe it is important. And I'm pleased to hear what the Governor of the Bank of England has said today on the importance of free trade around the world. On the first point that my honourable friend raises, I'm grateful that he has asked me that question rather than relying on what someone said to someone else as overheard by someone else in a bar. It's very clear the government's position is the same. We triggered Article 50. In fact, this House voted to trigger Article 50. That had a 2-year timeline. That ends on the 29th of March. We want to leave with a deal, and that's what we're working for.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, I asked the Prime Minister to unblock the funding for Dawlish to give us the investment to improve that train line. 2 weeks later, we still have no funding. I worry, Mr. Speaker, that Brexit is causing the government to sit on announcements that need to be made, both on rail funding and the long-term basing of the Royal Marines for Plymouth. So can the Prime Minister tell the Transport Secretary to get on with it and announce the funding for Dawlish this week without any further delay?
Well, to the honourable gentleman, as I said to him then, the department's been reviewing the proposals that Network Rail have put forward for an effective and resilient solution in relation to the Dawlish line, and there'll be an update on funding in due course. There is, of course, already the first phase of work to protect the seawall at Dawlish began in November. That's part of the 15 million wider investment to make the railway at Dawlish and Teignmouth more resilient to extreme weather.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know from the doorstep in Corby and East Northamptonshire that local people want to see more police officers out on the beat, catching criminals and deterring crime. With the additional money that she's rightly announced for policing, will she join me in calling for that to be invested in frontline presence?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that I recognise the comments he's made, obviously, from the doorstep. I know he's an assiduous member who listens to his constituents and takes their views and brings them into this chamber. It is, of course, important that we have made more money available to police forces. I'm pleased to say that what we are now seeing is that the number of people joining officers joining police forces is at its highest level for 10 years. But we did make more money available to police forces, £970 million over the next year. What I think is a sadness in this chamber is that the Labour Party voted against it.
C. Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What has the Prime Minister got against towns in North Wales? In the week following the loss of a £20 billion Hitachi contract in the region, the government she leads announced the moving of 380 Wrexham tax office jobs to Liverpool and to Cardiff city centre. Is it her view that towns across the UK should not have public sector jobs?
No, it is not. And I have to say to the honourable gentleman, on the issue that he raised about the Hitachi site at Wilfer site, we did offer a package of support. We offered a package of support that no previous government had been willing to consider, of 1/3 equity, all debt financing, and a strike price of no more than £75 per megawatt hour. Ultimately, we couldn't reach an agreement between all parties at this stage, and Hitachi decided on a commercial basis to suspend the project. But they've made clear they wish to continue discussions with the government on bringing forward new nuclear at Wilfer, and will support those discussions.
Mr. Johnson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the last 4 years, the number of people who have been stopped and searched by the police has fallen by 2/3. At the same time, the number of stabbings has increased by 1/3. Does the Prime Minister therefore agree with me that, carried out in the right way, stop and search is an effective part of the battle against knife crime?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I absolutely agree that, carried out in the right way, stop and search is an effective tool for our police forces. We recognise the concern there is about violent crime, and obviously he specifically raised the knife crime issue. That's why the Home Secretary has published the serious violence strategy. We've established a serious violence task force. But on the point about stop and search, just to reiterate, what we want the police to do is to use stop and search properly and lawfully. It is a vital and effective policing tool. What we expect them is, when they use stop and search, they do it lawfully.
Steve McCabe.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you recall the halcyon days when the Prime Minister told a rapturous Tory conference that she'd put an end to rip-off energy companies once and for all. On Thursday, Ofgem relaxed her energy cap. On Monday, E.ON announced a 10% price increase, and now we discover that the number of households in official fuel poverty has grown to over 2.5 million. How does she think she's doing?
I say to the honourable gentleman that, of course, it is this government that has introduced the energy price cap. This is not something that was done by the previous Labour government. It has provided protection to 11 million households, and energy suppliers will no longer be able to rip off customers on poor value tariffs. It will save consumers a total of £1 billion on their bills annually. And the Citizens Advice Bureau has previously said the cap means people are paying a fairer price now and will continue to pay a fairer price even if the level of the cap rises.
Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 2014, the number of children being excluded from schools has risen by 67%. Every school week, there are 4,253 children with special educational needs who have been permanently excluded or have fixed exclusions from school. This is a burning social injustice. Will my right honourable friend update the House on the progress of the Timpson review into excluded children, and confirm whether or not the government will make schools accountable for the outcomes of the pupils they exclude, as our Education Select Committee recommended and the Secretary of State has suggested?
Well said. Thank my right honourable friend and the Education Select Committee for their work on this important issue. Obviously, we all recognise that good discipline in schools is essential, but it's also important to ensure that any exclusion is lawful, reasonable and fair. And of course, guidance does set out that head teachers should, as far as possible, avoid permanently excluding any pupil with an educational healthcare plan, and make additional efforts to provide extra support to avoid excluding those with special educational needs. We do want to ensure that schools play their part in supporting children who've been excluded, working in collaboration with alternative providers and local authorities. My right honourable friend mentioned the Timpson review. That is still ongoing, but I can assure him that when it reports in due course, we will look very seriously and very carefully at the recommendations it provides.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since 2013, 220 parliamentarians and 450 members of their staff have received mindfulness training here in Parliament. Our cross-party group has produced this report, Mindful Nation Report, into the uses of mindfulness in education, health, prisons and the workplace, and it's been well received by government. After Brexit negotiations have been concluded, when she might need to de-stress, will she meet with representatives of our cross-party group and senior scientists to look at what more can be done with mindfulness to reduce human suffering and to promote human flourishing?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for raising this important issue, and also thank not just him but the Mindfulness APPG for the work that they've done and their recent report. And obviously he knows that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is recommended for use by NICE for adults with depression. But I noticed I recognise the training that has gone into staff. I recently, some weeks ago, had an individual from my constituency come into my surgery to talk about mindfulness, and the member of my parliamentary staff I had with me had actually undertaken the training and was therefore able to speak about the impact that had had. So the commissioning of psychological therapies is a matter for NHS England, but I'll ensure that they are aware of this report.
The gentleman is obviously a beneficiary of mindfulness himself. He seems a very calm and phlegmatic fellow these days, which wasn't always the case in the past. We're very grateful to the honourable gentleman. George Freeman.
The honours system is designed to acknowledge and celebrate great public service to our nation. Does my right honourable friend agree that when a small minority of recipients of honours, like Philip Green, bring the system of honours and business into disrepute by being found to have behaved disgracefully, letting down the vast majority in business who set the highest standards, then it's right that this party and this government should be the first to stand up for decent standards and look at beginning a process for seeing whether people who behave in that way should be stripped of their honour?
Can I say to my honourable friend that obviously, as he has just said, the honours system is there to recognise exceptional service and achievement in a wide range of spheres of public life. And it's important that if the recipient of an honour brings that honour into disrepute, steps should be taken to review that honour. Now, that, of course, there is a forfeiture process for that purpose. That does include an independent forfeiture committee, which gives recommendations to me for Her Majesty's approval. That is the process, but it's important, I believe, that we have that, so that anybody who has been in receipt of an honour that brings honour into disrepute, that steps can be taken to review that.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Last weekend, Millwall Lionesses from my constituency played and beat Lewis FC in the 4th round of the FA Cup. For winning, the Lionesses received £2,000 prize money. The winners of the same round in the men's competition received £180,000. Is the Prime Minister willing to put pressure on the FA to equalise prize money for the men's and women's competition as Wimbledon did in 2000?
Well, can I say to the honourable lady that as the president of the Wargrave Girls Football Club, I'm very willing to commend all those girls and females who play football. And I think members across this House have been concerned to hear of the disparity in the winnings that she has raised with this House. Obviously, this is a matter for the football authorities, but I'm sure they will have heard the concern that's been expressed in this House about the current position.
Heidi Allen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It takes courage and leadership to admit difficult things, because that's how we start to recognise the need for change. So I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions for acknowledging there has been a link between accessing universal credit and food bank usage. But it isn't the case that there has been a link. There is a link. Will the Prime Minister please urgently review the 5-week wait and the benefit freeze? Both must go. Because the unpalatable truth is that our welfare safety net is no longer holding up those most vulnerable in society. It's tangling around their feet and dragging them under the water.
Well, my honourable friend and I have discussed the universal credit and the rollout of universal credit in the past. As she will know, we've taken a number of measures. As we have been rolling this out slowly and carefully, we've taken a number of measures to address issues that have arisen. Shortly after I became Prime Minister, we cut the taper rate so people could keep more of the money that they earned. Subsequently, we have, of course, ensured that we scrapped the 7-day waiting. We've introduced the two-week overlap in relation to those in receipt of housing benefit. And, of course, we have also ensured that 100% of a full monthly payment is available to people at the start for those for whom that is necessary. So we have been taking steps and will continue to look at universal credit. But universal credit is a system that encourages people into work and makes sure that work pays, compared to a legacy system from the Labour Party that left 1.4 million people for nearly a decade trapped on benefits.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite our party's manifesto promise, nearly 7,000 pensioner households in my West Lancashire constituency could lose their free TV licences. Often that's their only source of company. Is the government going to keep their manifesto promise by taking back the responsibility they've outsourced to the BBC to ensure that older people keep their TV licences?
The Honourable Lady, obviously I recognise the value that people across the country place on having a television, and for many elderly people, obviously, the connection that brings with the world, and that's why the free licences for the over 75s are so important. We've been clear that we want and expect the BBC to continue free licences when they take over responsibility for the concession in 2020. Can I just say, I think taxpayers rightly want to see the BBC using its substantial licence fee income in an appropriate way to ensure it delivers fully for UK audiences.
Richard Graham!
Mr. Speaker, my constituent Ben Seaman receives employment and sport allowance benefits and was awarded £20,000 after the recent court ruling on ESA underpayments. Ben has to spend a lot of this within a year in order to avoid having more than £16,000 of assets and risk losing eligibility for ESA. Clearly, this is an unintended anomaly. So would my right honourable friend encourage the Work and Pension Secretary, who I know is sympathetic to the situation, to resolve this as soon as possible through an exemption, both for Ben and for any others similarly affected?
Thank you. Obviously, this is a concerning case that my honourable friend has raised with me. I understand the DWP are aware, and I'm assured that they are looking into this issue, but I will ensure that my honourable friend receives a response as soon as possible.
Kyle!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's determination has been widely acknowledged, but the truth is she can't get her deal through unless something fundamentally changes in that deal. But there is a way she can get it through, which would also lead to you can get it through unchanged, which would also help with the reconciliation of our country on the other side. It does mean following the example of the Good Friday Agreement and having confirmation of the people afterwards. But it does mean that there are fundamental benefits to that happening. I'm not asking her to pass judgment on that at the dispatch box right now, but would she agree to meet with me and my honourable friend, the member for Sedgefield, just to briefly talk it through and explore the possible benefits?
The honourable gentleman, I think he knows my view in relation to a second referendum. I have expressed that on many times in this House, and my view on that has not changed. I believe it is important that we deliver on the first referendum. But of course, I and colleagues are meeting members from across this House to discuss the issues that they wish to raise in relation to the Brexit matter. And so I will ensure that the honourable gentleman and his honourable friend, the member for Sedgefield, meet, if not with me, then with an appropriate minister.
Mr. Speaker, with the return of the Royal Air Force Tornadoes from operations for the last time, would my right honourable friend join with me in paying tribute not just to this remarkable jet, which has given 40 years of operations from the Cold War through to the mountains of Afghanistan, but to the remarkable men and women who have flown and maintained her?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I'm very happy to join with him in paying tribute to the Tornado and to the men and women who have flown and maintained the fleet over the last 40 years. He's referenced the Cold War to the mountains of Afghanistan, from the Gulf War through to operations against Daesh in Syria and Iraq. The Tornado has been an integral and vital part of our AF operations. And I think, as my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, said last week, it's with a heavy heart but enormous pride that we bid farewell to the Tornado from operations, having played that vital role in keeping Britain and the Allies safe. It will, of course, be replaced with worthy successors in the improved Typhoon and the new F-35s, which keep us as a world leader in air combat, but I'm very happy to pay tribute from this dispatch box to the plane and to all those men and women who have both flown and maintained it over those 40 years.
Savile Roberts.
The UK's democracy is defunct. Its economy and society chronically unequal. Britain is breaking. Mr. Speaker, let us speak as others find us. This plain truth has not gone unnoticed. In pubs, clubs and homes, on pavements at schools and workplaces, in a Yes is More gig in Cardiff this Friday, people talk about this place and how Westminster is failing them. When will the Prime Minister lift her gaze above party interests, above Westminster interests? When will she work with others to remake this island as three self-sufficient, thriving nations, rather than perpetuate the assumption of privilege for one?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady that when I became Prime Minister, I was very clear that I wanted a country that worked for everyone. That was the entire United Kingdom. I note that in her question, she failed to recognise that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. We want Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom. And can I also say to her that democracy is not defunct. Democracy in this country will be shown by this House recognising the vote that took place in 2016, delivering on the result of the referendum and voting for a deal for us to leave the EU.
In Bradley!
Mr. Speaker, despite our comparative size, the UK has more government departments than even the USA, and we hear in this place all the time about the challenges of cross-departmental working. Will my right honourable friend commit to looking carefully in the spending review at opportunities to shrink the size of government and instead focus our spending on public services?
Can I say to my honourable friend that I know the question of the size of government that a number of colleagues, and of course we are employing more civil servants in order to ensure that we deliver on Brexit, something I believe is close to my honourable friend's heart.
Brown!
Mr. Speaker, Mariam is just 6 months old. She's beautiful. She was recently diagnosed with a devastating form of muscular dystrophy. Her brother had the same condition and died tragically young. Spinraza is a new, highly effective drug produced by Biogen, available in 23 countries, but not England. If Mariam lived in the west of Scotland and not West Ham, she'd get it. But negotiations between NICE and Biogen haven't been successful, leaving Mariam and 2 other babies I know of as tiny pawns in an argument between price and profit. Will the Prime Minister please intervene and tell others and Mariam from suffering an early and painful death?
Obviously, the Honourable Lady has raised the case with great passion in this House. I will ensure that a Minister from the Department of Health looks at the issue and responds to her.
Giles Watling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the consumption of dog and cat meat goes against our British values. They are our companions, they are not food. Does my right honourable friend agree that a ban on consumption here, where astoundingly it is still legal, would put us in a leading position, sending a clear message to the rest of the world that the sickening and horrific suffering that these animals experience during slaughter should be stopped? If so, will she commit to this change, which has cross-party support, as demonstrated by amendment to the Agriculture Bill?
Can I say to my honourable friend, obviously I'm aware of the amendment that he has put to the Agriculture Bill, and I thank him for raising this issue. The welfare of animals is a priority for this government. Of course, I am pleased it is illegal to sell dog and cat meat in the UK, and there are no abattoirs licensed to slaughter dogs, and thankfully there is no evidence of human consumption of dog or cat meat in the UK, and I certainly hope that other countries will join the UK in upholding the highest standards of animal welfare.
Order. In wishing the Honourable Lady a very happy birthday and hoping that the House will join me in doing so, I call Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 21 again. My constituent, Harriet, recently gave birth to her baby 3 months premature. When Harriet was due to return to work, her baby had only recently come out of hospital, and she had to make the choice between taking additional time off work but struggling to pay the bills, or to return to work but miss crucial bonding time with her baby. The government had committed to reviewing this issue by the end of January. We're now halfway through February, so will the Prime Minister commit to take action and to extend parental leave to the parents of children who end up in neonatal wards?
Thank you. First of all, happy birthday to the Honourable Lady. We are reviewing this situation, and we're also looking at the circumstances, other circumstances, for example, like miscarriage, and what applies in those circumstances. But I'll ensure that a written response is given to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you. Finally, Craig McKinley. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has shown today that little knowledge is a very dangerous thing. He chose to speak about Seabourn and Ramsgate Port in my constituency of South Thanet. He does not speak for South Thanet, I do. Can my right honourable friend assure me that the people of Thanet are ready and prepared to keep that port open for Brexit eventualities? Could she give a commitment to Thanet District Council to indemnify them for costs here on in?
Can I say to my honourable friend that no one can doubt the passion and vigour with which he speaks up for the people of his South Thanet constituency. He's raised the issue of Ramsgate Port. I am aware of the interaction that's been, the discussion that has been between Thanet Council and the Department for Transport, and I believe that continues. Obviously, I recognise the significance of the possibility of ensuring that there is suitable capacity available to access Ramsgate Harbour, and I will ensure that the Department of Transport looks at the specific issue that he has raised.
Order. Yes, on this occasion I will take the point of order from the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, because I gather that it appertains to the session which has just concluded. But I just very gently say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that I hope that this isn't a cheeky ruse to be deployed on a weekly basis to secure for himself a third question which our procedures do not allow, because that would be very wrong, and I'm sure that the Right Honourable Gentleman wouldn't knowingly do anything very wrong. We'll put it to the test. There's a certain amount of chuntering from a sedentary position, not least from the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Broxtowe, to suggest that she thinks that he might engage in such behaviour. But I'm a charitable chap, and I'm prepared to give him a chance. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and heaven forbid that anyone would abuse the privilege that you afford us on such occasions. Mr. Speaker, I think all of us recognise the responsibility of the language we use in discourse that we have in this House. And can I try and be helpful to the Prime Minister, because perhaps inadvertently she misled the House when she said that there was no plan for Scottish independence, because unlike the Brexit campaign, it was no more than a slogan on the slide of a bus. We had, Mr. Speaker.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman who's brandishing a document, and I've got a feeling it will feature in his next press release. And seriously, he's made his point with force and alacrity, which requires no reply. And I hope the Honourable Gentleman is satisfied with his prodigious efforts, but we'll leave it there. Well, the Honourable Gentleman ought to know about good behaviour in the Chamber and elsewhere. The Honourable Gentleman is a distinguished football referee. I tell people watching our proceedings. Point of order, Mr. Douglas Ross.
I appreciate that, Mr. Speaker, and I just wonder, for clarification, since the Right Honourable Gentleman held up a copy of the SNP's white paper, how I could get on record that that white paper actually contained many errors and omissions. For example, it didn't include any transition costs, it wildly overstated the predicted revenue from oil, and interestingly, many of the proposals contained in that white paper were actually already powers that the Scottish Government and the SNP had at Holyrood in Edinburgh.
Let me just say to the Honourable Gentleman that he has found his own salvation, as he well knows. Hitherto, I had always thought that the honourable gentleman, the member for Anhelion and Yar, was a notably cheeky chappy in the chamber. But I realise that the role of cheeky chappy is not confined to the Scottish National Party. But we're grateful to the honourable gentleman who's made his point and looks very delighted with his efforts. We'll leave it there if there are no further points of... Point of order. Yes, well, the honourable gentleman from Anhelion and Yar looks very happy. Yes, we don't need to hear from him further at this time. Yes, I know. No, but I remind the honourable gentleman that he also has a cerebral status as the chair of a select committee and should behave with due decorum to reflect the very high standing he enjoys, possibly in Scotland, but certainly in the House. Point of order, Mary Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's something that's been troubling me for a few weeks now. When I first came here, I was told that the protocol of the chamber was that you never cross the line of sight between the Speaker and whoever he is speaking with. However, on multiple occasions, this chamber empties whenever Mr Blackford, the honourable member for Skye and Lochaber, gets up, to the point where the Speaker is in the middle of answering a question and people are cutting off his line of sight. Could the Speaker please advise on how this can be corrected?
Well, what I would say to the honourable lady is twofold. First of all, it is a breach of the conventions of this House for a member to walk past a member who has the floor on that side of the House. That is unseemly and discourteous behaviour, and I think it falls into the category which the honourable lady is helpfully deprecating. Secondly, I hope the honourable lady won't take it amiss if I say that it is regrettable that her prodigious efforts on behalf of her party leader have not been witnessed by the right honourable gentleman himself, for the simple reason that he has already exited the chamber. However, the saving grace for the honourable lady is that her efforts have been observed by no less a figure than the Chief Whip of the Scottish National Party, and that, I think, probably bodes well for the honourable lady in the future. We'll leave it there for now. If there are no further points of order, we come now to the urgent question in the name of Mr. Barry Gardner.
Thank you, sir. To ask the Secretary of State for International Trade to make a statement on the progress he's made in replicating trade agreements between the UK and those countries with whom the EU has a trade agreement.
Short statement, eh?
The Secretary of State for International Trade, Secretary Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of the EU, the UK currently participates in around 40 free trade agreements with over 70 countries. In 2018, the trade agreements in force constituted around 11% of our trade. These free trade agreements cover a wide variety of relationships, including free trade agreements, economic partnership agreements with developing nations, and association agreements which cover broader economic and political cooperation, and mutual recognition agreements. The Government's programme for providing continuity and stability for businesses, consumers and investors in our international agreements is of utmost importance. We're committed to ensuring these benefits are maintained, providing for a smooth transition as we leave the EU. Of course, the House will be well aware that the best way to provide that continuity and stability is to ensure that we have a deal with the European Union so that the UK can remain covered by all of these agreements during the implementation period. Mr. Speaker, we have already signed a number of agreements, including with Switzerland, the largest in terms of our trade flows, representing over 20% in terms of value of all our rollover agreements. We've also signed agreements with Chile and the Faroe Islands, and an economic partnership agreement with Eastern and Southern Africa, and the text of these agreements, the explanatory memoranda and parliamentary reports for these agreements have already been laid in the libraries of both houses. As we leave the EU, we have no intention of making our developing country partners worse off, as the opposition would have us do by abandoning EPAs. And it's important for the prosperity of their people that we maintain our trading relationships so that they have the opportunity to lift themselves out of poverty. We have recently reached agreement with Israel and the Palestinian Authority and intend to sign those agreements shortly, and just today we have reached agreement on the UK Pacific EPA. We've also signed mutual recognition agreements with Australia and New Zealand, and will be closing 2 with the United States soon. A number of negotiations are at an advanced stage. As with all international negotiations, Mr. Speaker, and indeed any negotiations, they will go down to the wire, and I would expect nothing different from these agreements. That's the way that countries do business. To put the economic value of these agreements in perspective, countries covered by the 20 of the smallest agreements account for under 0.8% of all the UK's total trade. As for those countries where we may not be able to get a full agreement signed by exit day, it's responsible to ensure that we have contingencies in place should we end up, unfortunately, in a no-deal scenario. That's exactly what my department, alongside the FCO and the Department for International Development, are doing. We will shortly be updating businesses and the House with progress on these agreements, and will continue to inform the House as soon as further agreements are signed in line with our established parliamentary procedures.
Barry Gardner.
Yesterday, the Department's risk matrix for the so-called rollover agreements was published in the media. Of the 40 agreements the Secretary of State famously promised would be ready 1 second after midnight on exit day, precisely 4 have been signed. 9 are off track, 19 significantly off track, 4 are not possible to be completed by March 2019, and 2 are not even being negotiated. Throughout the passage of the trade bill, members repeatedly raised concerns that it would not be possible to fully replicate the terms of these agreements, and that many countries would seek to renegotiate terms in their favour. I would therefore ask the Secretary of State if he will write to me to set out for each country what objections or demands to concluding a new rollover have been presented, what concessions he has offered in respect of preferential access to UK markets in order to overcome such obstacles, what assessment he has made of the impact on trade flows with the UK of a failure to conclude a new deal. Many in the business community feel that the Secretary of State has diverted too much of his department's resources on entirely new free trade agreements, and so keen has he been to grandstand with the new that he's ignored the fundamental grinding work of securing what we already have. So I ask the Secretary of State to write and set out the number of full-time personnel engaged upon securing entirely new agreements, the number engaged upon securing the rollovers. I'd ask him to set out whether he believes his department has been adequately resourced to handle so many trade negotiations at once. Recently, the Secretary of State suggested the unilateral liberalisation of tariffs in the event of a no-deal Brexit. I ask the Secretary of State to explain to the House now how he thinks negotiations would go with the remaining rollover countries once he'd given up our key negotiating leverage by reducing all tariffs to 0. Most members might think that by doing so, we were the ones being rolled over. Will he now categorically rule out such a proposal? Goods are being loaded onto vessels as we speak that will be arriving in our markets from overseas after the 29th of March. How does the Secretary of State intend to support business with these transactions when nobody knows what tariffs and non-tariff barriers they will face when they arrive at their destination port? Increasingly, Mr. Speaker, the Department of International Trade looks as if it has inadequate resources focused on the wrong priorities set by incompetent ministers.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as ever, the honourable gentleman gives us a rich menu of the things on which he's wrong to be able to comment. The first thing is, of course, that if we want to ensure that all our agreements are rolled over, then the best way to do so is to reach a deal with the European Union so that they will apply 1 minute after midnight. That's the best way to do it. I voted for that continuity. Did the honourable gentleman? Did his party? The second thing is, he asked on what reasons countries may not want to continue. I have had discussions with a number of politicians on the other side of the House about this. Some countries have said that they didn't like, for example, some of the human rights elements that were incorporated by the European Union, and they would like us to drop those in order to roll the agreements over. Mr. Speaker, I am not inclined to do so, because the value we attach to human rights is an important part of who we are as a country. The honourable gentleman was wrong. Rather than diverting resources in my department from rollover agreements to future free trade agreements, I've done exactly the opposite, to reduce the number working on potential future free trade agreements, to give maximal resource for this. And finally, he was wrong. I didn't advocate unilateral liberalisation of tariffs. That was something that was mentioned in a newspaper. And the government will determine what its day one tariffs will be as a collective decision in the event of no deal.
Mr Kenneth Clark.
Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend is quite right to stress that if we were to leave on the 29th of March with no deal, it would indeed have a disastrous effect for many industries, because we would suddenly lose very important trading agreements across the world we've enjoyed for many years. But does he not accept that, I agree with him on that, when we get into the transition period, he's still going to face enormous difficulties and will need a very long transition period to start negotiating so many trade deals with so many important markets for our economy. And does he not accept that his principal problem is the lack of bargaining power that the United Kingdom on its own has compared with the European Union as a bloc carrying out bargain arrangements? And that he raises human rights and things, but very important countries like Japan and South Korea and others are going to expect better terms from the United Kingdom at the expense of the United Kingdom than they've had to give to the EU. He says they will take it to the wire. He accepts he's having tough negotiations. Would he contemplate urging on his colleagues, even at this stage, moving to some sort of customs arrangement and regulatory alignment with the rest of the European Union, which will rescue us from these chaotic negotiations and allow us to enjoy the benefits of trade agreements, which for the most part were ones that previous Conservative British governments actually urged upon our EU partners and took a leading role in getting put in place in the first place?
My right honourable friend raises some, as ever, some very interesting points. While there would undoubtedly be a greater risk in the case of no deal, I would not agree with my right honourable friend that it would be disastrous, because we're likely to maintain a high proportion of the continuity of these agreements. Let me just remind him that 5 of those 40 agreements represent 76% by value of the trade that falls in this category. When it comes to transitioning to new agreements, in fact, my department has developed a great deal of expertise and knowledge in this process. There are those who say if we end up getting a deal, much of this work that has been done will be wasted. I would completely disagree. It has created a body of knowledge and experience and expertise in the department which will stand us in good stead. As for our ability to negotiate with other countries, we remain the world's 5th biggest economy, and many countries have said to us it would be much easier to do an agreement with the United Kingdom as a single country which would then negotiate and ratify than to have to do it with 28 countries as they do at the present time. And in terms of Japan, we have of course made clear and finished our public consultation on the potential membership of CPTPP, on which subject we are likely to have a debate in this House next week. And finally, my right honourable friend says, should we not stay in a customs union? That would preclude us from having negotiations on new agreements, such as the United States or even China, with which the European Union has no agreement at the present time.
Mr. Udozi.
Because the Secretary of State has just said countries say it would be easier to do a deal with the UK. If it was so easy, one might ask the rather simple question, why have we not even been able to roll over more than a half dozen of the deals we currently have? And the leaked documents paint a picture of unvarnished failure. South Korea and Canada off track, Japan no chance of completion. Deals are not simply necessary in the event of a no-deal Brexit, but may well be required at the end of the transition period if the negotiation then is as miserable as what we've seen to date. So why doesn't the Secretary of State own up? The time has run out to negotiate these deals. It is highly unlikely the Prime Minister's deal, which he supports, will be accepted by this House. This is now the evidence he and others need to put their weight behind an extension to Article 50 so that his government, his department, at least can complete the simple task of rolling over the deals which we currently have.
But, Mr. Speaker, again I make the point. If members opposite want us to get trade continuity, the best way is to vote for the deal that the Prime Minister has already set out. And as for future FTAs, we could not negotiate those were we to follow his advice and remain in a customs union.
Speaker, I've had a careful look at the passage of these agreements through this House in the first place. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, every single one of